Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our holiday spending budgeting for a stress-free giving season. My name is Kelly Blount, and I am today's moderator. We have an exciting agenda planned for you today on understanding what budgeting may look like for the holiday season. With that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn things over to Todd Moore, Director of Education with Trinity Debt Management, to introduce himself and take us through today's presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. And once again, thank you to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time. This is always one of my funnest moments working through presentations. We get to talk about the holidays, and it's always a great time to do that. It's exciting that we're starting this process now. You know, we have this beautiful fall day, but we are only 8 weeks from Black Friday. It's hard to believe that we are just now creeping up on the holidays. So lots to talk about today. Got three broad themes that we want to talk about today. We want to talk about how to plan for the holidays. We want you to have a stress-free holiday. How to budget appropriately this year, saving ourselves, kind of categorizing our expenses, getting things in order so that we don't enter into the new year with excessive debt. And then how to be savvy this year about how we finance this holiday season. So let's dive in. I wanted to give you some background. What's different this year as opposed to maybe thinking about the holidays last year? And started out by looking at the Bankrate Early Holiday Spending Survey. So there's three things here that really stood out from that survey research. One is there's concern with tariffs. You know, we hear all the tariff talk right now in our news media, but you know, how will these tariffs impact this holiday season? So when we look at the survey itself, 41% of holiday shoppers are concerned that holiday gifts will be more expensive than they were last year. So there's this sentiment, consumer sentiment, that gifts this year the costs may increase through time. So that's the first thing. Second, you know, consumers are certainly going to be spending money. You know, most consumers that were surveyed certainly plan to have a holiday. There's that sense of normalcy. Folks want to continue to have a wonderful holiday despite, I mean, we went through all sorts of things with COVID, and goodness, it's been a mess. But the one constant is we want to have a great holiday season. So folks plan to spend money, but I think what you'll see here is, again, folks are thinking, at least those in the survey are thinking about how they plan for this holiday with potential increased costs. You know, 42% of shoppers believe that, you know, holiday shopping will be more expensive. So their choices may change. Folks are thinking about the holidays perhaps a little bit differently, at least through this survey. And then a second survey that I looked at was the Holiday Outlook Survey. So here, because of those three factors, you know, inflation and tariffs, that folks are saying that perhaps they plan to spend a little less than they have in the past. Now we'll see if that holds true as we look at next year, but because of those factors, folks are, you know, thinking about, you know, these increased costs. So it may shift how things work in the market. For us, that may be that we make different choices. We're going to get into some of that as we move through the presentation. But certainly, you know, the costs of things, it's definitely on consumers' minds. Where are we looking at in terms of just national numbers with what's projected? So this holiday season, at least from the projections, $1,552 per person. Okay, so that's down a little bit from last year. So that just gives you some kind of national numbers to look at, some things that folks are kind of thinking about the holiday, how it may impact some of your choices. We may see tariffs increase costs on certain items. How do we get ahead of those things to plan now and to get our budget in order so that we can finance those items through time? You know, that's one of the things we want to take away from these surveys. So first thing, the outcome of this, I would say, is a peak shopping season, as it has been, you know, for years, is that sometimes it's referred to as the 5 days that matter. So we're talking about November 27th through December 1st. This is the Black Friday, Cyber Monday period. what's interesting here is that, the peak of the shopping season, despite tariffs, where those good deals may fall, those sorts of things, we can assume that this is those 5 days that are probably going to matter the most for our holiday shopping. Okay. So again, that, our shopping cycle is kind of holding through, true. Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there's going to be important periods. And I thought it was really interesting here. 80% of holiday gifts have been spent by the end of Cyber Monday. And that's a tremendous number, So when you think about folks that are planning, at least nationally, 80% of folks who are budgeting or just thinking about the holidays, our consumer spending, about 80% is within those 5 days. I think that's just a very interesting number. So how do we get you into this holiday season and allow for really a stress-free holiday? Okay. So one of the things that we know for sure is that despite whatever tools we use with budgeting and savings, the fact that, we're in the holiday season, it's very easy for us to overspend, and there's a number of reasons for that, but we certainly want to create a wonderful experience for our family. And we want to have, we want to show love and consideration for all those around us. So the holidays certainly can become very expensive. So first thing, we want you to really start to think about creating a realistic budget. I'll show you later a spreadsheet that you can use, and we'll talk about some various methods, but we really want you to start thinking about what your holiday season budget will look like. Nationally, I gave you a number, 1552. That's certainly $1,000, let's just say $1,500. For many of us, that may be in the ballpark, and for some of us, that could be a low number. So we have to really think about, it's going to be really unique to you. And then how much do you really plan to spend this year? So one of the things we're going to be thinking about is, what's our bottom line? How much are we really looking at? And then also, as we work our way through putting together our expenses and really making a plan, what kind of debt are we looking at if we overspend? We really want to try to get you through this holiday season. My plan today is try to get you through this holiday season without walking into 2026 with excessive credit card debt and just, money that just is very difficult to come up with as we enter into the new year. So we're going to put together a budget that will work for us and make certain that we have a wonderful holiday. So looking back, just first things first here, a couple of things that I'm going to encourage you to do. If you look back from last year, and, certainly I've been in this situation before over the years, I'm sure many others have as well, but when you look back, into last year, did you overspend? Are you carrying credit card debts or other debts that you've accumulated from last year's spending? If that is the case, we want to kind of break that cycle looking at 2026. Going into the new year with excessive debt, we always have this kind of forecasting error sometimes that we always assume that things are going to work out. It may be we believe that we're going to have more income, or that, this year is going to be fantastic. Look at all these plans that we have looking into 2026. Sometimes that forecasting bias, that belief that things are just going to be wonderful, it really creates a tendency to overspend. I'm gonna ask you to, or caution you against that belief. Let's be realistic. Let's kind of narrow things this year. So if you've overspent last year, we want to narrow some of that debt, try to have a wonderful holiday, but know that there's other priorities heading into 2026. We can't just have, a blowout here in 2025 for Christmas or other holiday spending, and then just continue to kind of suffer with debts. So if you overspent, let's change that behavior. And then as you look at, kind of look back at last year to get things together, certain categories where maybe those things just don't serve you as well. What could you have done differently? If you overspent on decorations or overspent on certain technology items or too much travel, things like that, the key here is to really think about what's most important this year. How can you prioritize your spending so that you can have a wonderful holiday and get the most bang for your buck? What can you do with that? Just kind of think through those items. In some cases, you may feel that that is, kind of limiting some of the things that maybe you want to do. But again, if financially the outcome is we're not going into the new year with debt, we've probably done a good job. And then the last thing is, if last year seemed to work fairly well and you were able to pay off some of your debt quickly, within 90 days or something like that, that's a reasonable frame. Well, maybe that's a good parameter for what we might want to budget around this year. So we have some consistency in our spending. Okay, so I hope that helps as you kind of think about where you want to go. But the key here is to prioritize how we want the holidays to look and feel this year. So in that planning process, most importantly, and I think this holds true in so many parts of our lives, the better the planning, the better the outcome, I believe, in most cases. So when we're thinking about, for folks who may, and I've certainly been guilty of this, that may rush into last minute purchases, there's always going to be overspending in that process. So the better that we can start to either start a savings now and continue that savings, maybe even into the new year. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the more that we can just start down this path of thinking of what that number should look like, let's say $1,500, $2,000 at the, start to narrow in on what that number is. We want to get away from the last minute rush into things. Impulse buys are going to lead to overspending. One thing that happens during the holidays, we wait till the last minute. Some of the top ticket items are already picked over. And then we start relying on kind of sales items, or we do internet searches to try to find certain items. And we can't find what we're looking for in a lot of cases, wind up, particularly if you're going out to try to find certain items, we wind up overspending. So start early so that we can just have a more relaxed holiday season. If the kids or the family are thinking about certain items, start now kind of looking ahead and thinking about what those items are and what it's going to take to finance them, because impulsive buys or just being rushed, you're certainly going to overspend. Same thing if you're thinking about the holidays for even your grocery budget. Not having consistent plan there it's going to be the same thing around the holidays as well. You rush out, you walk into the store hungry, everything looks great, and next thing you know, what you had planned for the holidays is now turned into something excessive and probably way more than what you should have spent. So plan ahead. The other thing too here is that, and most folks are probably much better than I am at this, but just being savvy about how you shop. When we think about, some folks, when we're hunting for deals online, if you're doing that, again, I think the key here is those 5 days that matter. That's going to be, this period between Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Most of the research, as I showed in those first two slides, there's a lot of research around Black Friday and consumer spending. Folks in the retail market clearly understand that within those 5 days, the reason that number, was like 80% of all shopping done within those 5 days. I mean, that number is very important for us as consumers, because that's where we're going to find some of the most attractive deals. So if you are looking ahead, and we are thinking about that 8-week window right now, trying to save some money up for those 5 days of shopping, which retailers know is going to be the hottest 5 days for sales, start planning ahead now, and let's start putting together our budget. Make sure that we're ready when those deals hit. So we've talked a lot about just that initial planning and how much we can afford to spend. I've talked about just the budget broadly, somewhere around $1,500 just for illustration today. Could certainly be more, might even be less, but for today, I'm going to kind of stick around that number. Other things too is just broadly looking at your budget. We're talking about a holiday budget, but in this particular case, again, it's very important to be very aware of your overall income and expenses and how much debt we want to carry. If we are carrying any debt, our goal is to keep you out of debt, but just make certain that you're looking at affordability for this year. That's number one. And then we're going to shift now to thinking about how we put together a budget and how we set our priorities. Okay. So holiday expenses, I've just put together all budgets. We take that 1552. That's the number. That's the number we're kind of working around, $1,500. Of that $1,500, we've got categorized expenses. We have to pay for all these various choices, all these expenses. So gifts, food, decorations, clothing, travel. These are the big ones. I think these are the ones that are just part of a holiday experience. So, within those categories, you make the choice. So gifts certainly will probably be a big part of that. And then if we think about, Thanksgiving, which is also 8 weeks away, we got to kind of put this budget together and then categorize these overall expenses. There's a trade-off to each of these, so if we're looking at certain gifts that we want to finance, well, one of the trade-offs there might be that we don't do a lot of traveling this holiday season, or we cut back, or maybe we just narrow it down to maybe seeing family, and trying to organize that in a way that just minimizes overall expenses. The challenge is going to be keeping yourself disciplined through this process, because if you're thinking, well, I've kind of budgeted, $1,500, $2,000, I've kind of got things set, but wouldn't it be nice to go and do 2 more trips over here to see, my relatives and things like that? Try to put something together where we can minimize those additional expenses, because we'll start off with that assumed number. Next thing you know, we're way beyond where we should have started, or where we started. So each of these, the challenge is that each of them have trade-offs. So what we choose in one area, we have to give up in another area. That's going to be the one challenge for all of us that we face as we look at holiday expenses. But these are some of the big ones. The spreadsheet that I have categorizes all this work for you, and we'll try to look at that towards the end. But these are the big ones, and start to think about what that may look like heading into this holiday season. Stick to those spending limits, okay? So when we're thinking about how to do that, one way, and I always talk about the General Electric Credit Union tracking. You can just, there's ways to go on and use the Money Desktop materials that are provided to you through the credit union. If you want to track in real time, we can always take that larger number that we have as we move into the season. If you want to track that through your overall bank account itself, the point is have some accountability measure set up for yourself. If we start with a certain amount of money in mind, we have to track that through time and make sure that we're not over budget. And there's certainly going to be a tendency for us, or the temptation for us, to overspend. So we really want to, as I said in that first part of our presentation today, really focus on the planning part. That's really setting down, thinking as a family, what do we want this to look like? What do we want? What's most important to us this year? And if you can do that, that's a big part of keeping yourself out of overspending. Then after you've got that number, we want to think about how we kind of track our spending through time. So one way to do that is I'm going to encourage you to maybe just thinking about that 8 or 9 week window that we have. That's going to put some constraints on us because we only have 8 weeks. But if we want to think in the short term, starting to build that holiday fund, we could contact the credit union. I'm going to encourage you to do this, to set up a separate savings, where we can just start putting money into this holiday fund. So we got 8 weeks out. What can we reasonably start, transferring over through balance transfers? What can we do to start building this fund? So 8 weeks is where we're at in terms of just building some of this fund. But if you want to think broadly, if you start now and we set up a dedicated savings, well, even if we're spending down some of that savings, if we continue that savings at least into January, gives us a little broader time. That's 12 weeks out to Christmas. while we may deplete some of that fund, we're still going to continue to build that fund through time. We could enter into the new year, mostly out of debt. So if we're looking at $2,000 in total spending, we start now building a fund and putting those payroll deductions or putting money into this separate fund through balance transfers now. As we get through the holiday season and we continue to build that fund, we'll head into 2026 with minimal debt. Okay, we'll have that fund there available. So encourage you to do that in terms of financing this year's holiday. So that's setting up a savings account. Very easy. Reach out to Kelly and others at the credit union, and they'll make certain to make that happen for you. So we talked a little bit about tracking that fund. So once we have those dollars there, or you're just spending money, whether it's on a credit card or spending cash itself, we want, again, some way to track that through time. But what might we do in terms of just financing a holiday? How do we do that without accumulating a lot of debt? So we've talked about that dedicated savings fund. Very, very important. I'm a big fan of that. I'm going to try to, I've been doing it for a while. It's not always easy to stay within that fund, but that's one of my holiday goals myself, is try to get through the holiday without excessive debt. And then we're going to look at a couple other options for us when we think about the finance question, how we finance the holidays this year. Certainly maybe using only cash, and then a couple other tools that we can use. So we talked a little bit about that savings account. That's going to be part of your holiday strategy. Transferring funds or a payroll. If we're looking at, meeting that window of Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we're 8 weeks out. So that's a little narrow window for us, but we still have time to build funds. As I mentioned, I'm going to encourage you to look broadly, look, out into January, so that you can just continue to build that despite some of the funds that may come out. But the other thing here is when we're taking that approach, we're relying on cash and not relying on credit cards. So one thing that is very clear in the research is that last couple of years, credit card usage has been way up in terms of financing a whole range of things. And folks at the Fed and others are looking at this, assuming that credit card usage will still be in place as we look at the holiday season. One of the goals here, though, having that dedicated fund, it keeps us relying too heavily on credit cards. Many of us probably will use them at some point, and there's some savvy ways to do that. But if you're concerned about, just overspending this year, the more we can put into that fund and just really build it through time, the better. But I want to caution you about credit card usage. When we think about credit cards, a couple things here stand out. So if you're going to use some of your current credit cards, that's perfectly fine. But the question is, how quickly do you plan to pay that off? So we know that if we carry a lot, going into the new year, and if you're, as I mentioned from the beginning, if you're still mostly paying off large amounts of debt from previous holiday spending, we don't want that cycle to continue. We want to break that cycle looking at 2026. So for some folks, they may even think, hey, I've got, this year, what should I do? Maybe I should take out, a new credit card of some sort. Funds are a little limited. I don't have as much. I want to finance the holiday. What can I do? Well, I looked at the numbers here for just the average store card right now. It's around 30% interest rate for retail cards. So these are not major credit cards. These are retail cards unique to that store. So limited in scope in terms of how much we use that card. With a 30% interest rate, opening up those cards and carrying, thousands of dollars in credit card debt, it's very easy for us to get overextended and just to have excessive debts in the new year. So I want to caution you against that. If you do open up cards, these are kind of rates that I see at Trinity right now. Just be very cautious about that. And then as you look at an alternative to just credit cards and interest rates, you can compare what you might be able to get through the credit union, through General Electric Credit Union itself. So one option there would be, I don't have a lot to put away at this point. I can't save a whole lot, but maybe I just need a short-term loan to finance me through the holiday season, as opposed to interest at 30% and a credit card. Maybe a short-term loan would be a better option for you if that is the case. So I want you to be aware that there are some finance options for you, as opposed to just looking broadly at a credit card market where we don't know anything about the score ranges and we're just looking at retail cards to kind of get us through. One option is that you might be able to have a much better remedy by looking at a short-term loan, or even maybe a credit card through the credit union, as opposed to what you might get just broadly looking at retail cards. So just be aware of those options. There are some really good options at the credit union for you. And then in terms of next year, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I've always thought this is a really cool concept. I actually tried this myself, the 52-week challenge. So basically what you do, you start with week 1, you put $1 in, and then it goes up incrementally, $1 to where you get to $52 a week that you put in. So every week it goes up by an additional $1, the 52-week challenge. I think it works out to somewhere around like $1,400 at the end of the year. But I got pretty far into this process at one time. I got all the way into about late August, and then the kids wanted to do something fun for a summer vacation or something. It wound up, destroying my fun. But it was really interesting to do it. And I tried to get the kids involved in this challenge as well. Challenge yourself through this. What's really nice about it is that it's a really cool way to save some cash. And, there's a lot of creative ways you can kind of build savings into this. But, if you do something like this to where, you're working off $1 a week, savings goal, there's, $1,400 right there at the end of the year. Or you might even want to think about taking that same concept and just thinking about opening up a separate savings for next year, where you just make small dollar increments, $5, $10 a week that you put into a dedicated fund at the credit union, so that at the end of the year, your entire Christmas budget's already ready to go. Then you've got, you have build a fund. You can use that fund to fully fund your holiday spending and go into the following year largely without any debt. So very simple way to do that. But again, just thinking broadly about this, I'm hoping that you can see that we really want you to be aware of some of your options. If you're in a situation where, stress right now about the holidays, it's coming up and money's tight, as opposed to these 30% interest rates, please reach out. Let us know if there's maybe a better alternative for you. And I'm almost certain that there is. One other thing I want to caution you against, and I see a lot of this in the market right now, thinking again about how we finance the holidays. There's a lot going on around buy now, pay later lines of credit, paying for, and we've talked a little bit about this in a previous webinar, but they're really starting, folks are really starting to see the actual credit impact here, because now these are being reported to the buy now, pay later payment schemes now are being reported to the credit bureaus. So, there could be a lot that could impact your future credit from being late on these types of payments, those sorts of things. That behavior now is captured, reported to the bureau itself. But for me, more importantly, what I want you to understand is that while this is, while the tool itself can be very useful in some cases to finance certain items, the challenge is when it becomes abused. And that's largely true for lots of things in terms of the financial market, for credit market. But what I see here is that you'll have folks that, and I see this at Trinity all the time, they may have 10 buy now, pay later accounts. That's really over stretching yourself in terms of being able to do this, because what happens is, when it's 4 $37 payments and you have 10 of them, well, now how do I keep track of all my other expenses? Will I be able to keep the lights on this month? So we have to be very cautious about, again, that projection bias, or I'm sorry, that forecasting bias that comes in all the time. Again, we just assume, hey, I'll take this, you know, things are going to work out great. It's only $37 a week for 4 weeks. The ease of which this happens, you can really start to see where folks get overextended. I've seen this happen a lot around Christmas time and the holidays to finance certain things. And it just really has become a burden for so many folks because they've just really overextended their capacity. So I'm not saying that you can't use this method. Certainly it can be an effective method to finance certain items, but please be cautious as you do this because, you know, again, if you have, you know, 5, 10 accounts and you have to come up with all this money and pay by 4, this really becomes a challenge. You know, you don't want to see your car payment run late or your water bill shut off, you know, other expenses just not being met simply because we're kind of struggling with the income that we have to pay for these buy now, pay later accounts. So be careful. Again, I've talked about the small dollar personal loans, you know, $2,500, you know, that can create a pretty nice holiday. So reach out to the credit union as opposed to financing the holiday through, you know, excessive credit card debt, or trying to figure out a way to just roll the dice in the credit market and see if I can just apply for retail cards. This, again, very important, very simple, but it will keep you on, hopefully it will keep you focused around a certain dollar amount and pay off. And the other nice thing about this too, is because it's a smaller dollar loan and it's a personal line of credit, that those consistent payments all can point back to your payment history and your credit score. So you take off that $2,500 loan, we capture that payment history, and that also can improve, it can be a nice bump in our credit score. Just provide us a little credit capacity just by paying off that personal line of credit. So a nice way to do that and an affordable way to do it. And then lastly, 0% APR. I get a lot of questions about this sometimes. Hey, my score is strong. Should I take, you know, should I use the APR here? They're offering me a great deal. Yes, I mean, certainly if you're able to have, if your score is strong and we're able to take advantage of a 0% interest rate to finance something for the holiday, and we can pay that off, you know, we work within that frame of maybe 6 months or so to pay that off. Absolutely, you know, that's a great tool to use. And again, certainly credit consequences, mostly positive in this case, by paying that off within that time frame. The key here, I guess, again, as in all things, just make certain that it's affordable and make certain that we can reach that, you know, we don't want to take out credit that we can't pay off. In some of these card cases that are 0% interest, you know, if you don't meet that time frame or that payoff period, the interest can be very high. So we want to make certain that we pay things off quickly. But again, certainly a useful way to finance items, particularly bigger ticket items, if you're able to do that through a 0% interest. All right, so covered a lot of ground. Get you thinking about financing this holiday season and just moving into 2026 without excessive debts. So I'm going to leave you with a couple tips, and then hopefully we'll be able to pull up a spreadsheet that I can show you that you can use this holiday season. So when we think about tips, again, we talked about that planning stage, really setting down, thinking about what we want this holiday to look like. Going to reiterate that again, you know, planning. Cannot say enough about it. That plan gets translated over into our budget. And then we figure out how to finance everything, giving you some tips and some examples of how to do that. One thing here on this slide that I think is very important is this concept of delayed gratification. If we're thinking about overspending, this cooling off period, okay? So we head into the holidays. Todd, you've given us great examples, okay? We're gonna plan, we're gonna budget, then you walk in and all of a sudden, things start looking very different. You want to start purchasing all sorts of things. Please remember this concept of delayed gratification. You've done all this hard work, you've set everything up, you try to figure out how to finance things, and then you break the plan because we've over purchased on certain items. If you go in somewhere and to a store or online, you know, give yourself a moment to kind of really cool off, walk away. You know, so if you're thinking about that other travel adventure that you want, or the kids are excited about something and the budget's kind of tight, whatever it may be, you know, think about just kind of stepping aside for a moment, walk away. You know, most research would say just give yourself 24 hours, just walk away for 24 hours. If you can, it is a very useful way to kind of put in perspective those trade-offs. So when you look back at all those various expenses, you know, I walk away for 24 hours. Hey, well, maybe I can spend less on groceries, or I can spend less on whatever. Okay, it could be decorations, something like that. It forces you into confronting trade-offs. So delayed gratification, the real beauty of that is that you have to go back to your budget and say, what am I willing to give up to gain something else? And if you can't answer that question, then you probably should just walk away, okay? Because the outcome is you're going to overspend. So, you know, in addition to all the things we talked about today, if you really get excited about an item and it seems to go beyond where you're at, confront those trade-offs, give yourself a cooling off period so that you're not overspending. Comparison shopping here, I think, is a wonderful tool to avoid overspending. And this is really looking at comparison shopping with particular when we think about brands. You know, this comes in a lot of variation. This can come from tools to items that you purchase for technology, all sorts of things. And there may be some things that you're just not willing to compromise on. You know, a comparison for one item to the other just doesn't work. You find value or quality in that particular thing. But as we look at our budget this year, you know, when we are looking at some comparisons, that's one of the nice things I think about Black Friday or Cyber Monday, is that it really allows you to go through that process to do some really, you can become very savvy at this, you know, by just comparison shopping. You can really get into details about certain details of items and the quality of those items. But if you do the comparison, if you do comparison shopping, what will happen is that at some point, again, you'll find that there'll be some savings built into that process. So I challenge you, you know, step away from certain brands perhaps at times, find some of those savings, still aiming at quality, but comparison shopping is a very valuable way to an important way to save money. And then lastly, you know, we talked about this a little bit before, but avoid shopping sprees. You know, you get excited, particularly this for me, I think, is where we look at sales items. You know, you go in, maybe you're a last minute shopper and you see all these sales and you perceive all these sales, and then the next thing you know, it's an impulsive buy and you've overspent. I mean, I'm going to plead guilty. I've actually done this before because with work and other things, I got overextended just from not preparing enough for the holiday myself. And then I went on a shopping spree and it just didn't turn out well for me. The gifts were not all that great. I wound up spending a lot of money, and I can't say that anyone was really all that happy with what they got, but I got the job done. It was just a very poor way to do it. So don't make the same mistakes that I've made. Try to do some, avoid that process and avoid shopping sprees, save yourself some cash. So I just want you to know that I hope that you're excited about this holiday. I certainly am. You know, it's hard to believe that we're already heading into the last 3 months of 2025. I mean, wow. So, but it's a wonderful time, and there's so many things to be thankful for. So I just hope that what we've done today will get you thinking. That's number one thing. Think about the holiday, and we're going to try to prepare you to do that. So I'm going to try to exit out of these slides and show you one last trick here, and then we'll open up for any questions that we may have. So I'm trying to pull up my spreadsheet here, if I'm able to do that. Can you guys see that? Hopefully you can. Ellie, does that
Yes.
show
Yep.
on your
Yeah, your screen
okay,
showing.
great.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, here we have an Excel spreadsheet that you can download. It's included in the presentation itself, the Holiday Budget 2025. So what you have here is a great tool where you can log in, and I've put in over here 1552 for our number. That's what we kind of talked about for our presentation today. But you can see here where you're able to do all sorts of things to categorize expensive gifts and holiday meals and other items to kind of help you through this process. So it categorizes expenses for you, and you can plug in. What you want to do is plug in what you budgeted. So you put a number in, and then it will tell you whether or not you'll actually have to put two sets of numbers in, what you budgeted and what you actually spent. So here, I like this process because we talked through the presentation about you tracking your expenses. Well, when you have to put in the actual amount that you spent, as opposed to what you thought you were going to spend, right there, you're tracking your expenses, okay? So, you know, let's say for postage, we're gonna send some things off to the family. I assume that it was only gonna cost me $50. You know, I wound up spending $75 on shipping. You know, I've gone $25 negative. So you can start to see where, you know, this is a very easy way to take your holiday budget and build some numbers and try to really stay on track. This will get I've worked my way through this many, many times, and we haven't even talked about meals and other things for the holidays. But a very useful tool for you to be able to take what you've budgeted and categorize all expenses and track your expenses this year through real time. So I hope that's a valuable tool for you. And then once again, happy holidays. Hard to say that when we're still heading into the last 3 months of the year, but thank you again for joining us, and we appreciate your time. And with that, Kelly, I'll answer any questions that you have.
Yes, we have a few questions, so we'll get through as many as we can or end a little bit early depending on what happens. So, okay. Our first question, Todd, is how can I budget without feeling like I'm sacrificing the joy of giving?
Well, that's not an uncommon question. I think we all feel that strain. When we think about, you know, again, I cannot emphasize enough that it comes down to priorities. You know, it really comes down to priorities. The truth is we probably will never entirely feel that we're giving enough, you know. I mean, I certainly don't. I can do my very best, look at the numbers that I have, and there's always part of me that just feels like I should do more, you know, and even sometimes a little guilty for not doing more. But the truth is we just all have a certain limit. So part of that is just, I think that sentiment that we want to do so much, and that same feeling and gets us to the point where we wind up overspending. The only best advice I can give in this is just to know that, one, you're probably always going to feel that you're not doing enough, or that you could do more in some way. But so you can't really entirely escape that, but at least I don't believe I can. But the more that you can prioritize things, you know, you might just want to think about it this way, you know, the more that you can do in the planning process, the more you can think through. If you have, you know, X amount of funds, and you have to make some hard choices, and you had to prioritize what would be the most significant to put my money towards, or what would be the most significant for that particular person or your family, that's going to be the hard choice that you have to make. But without that feeling of sacrifice and those sorts of things, I would just say set clear priorities, really think that through, and just be confident in that decision. So the better you can plan, the better the outcome.
Our next question, Todd, is how do you avoid impulse spending during holiday sales and promotions?
How do we avoid it? Yeah, this is tough. The one thing that I would encourage you to do in terms of impulse spending is follow that delayed gratification rule. Okay, so we walk in. I'm certainly guilty of this myself. We walk in and you look around and you see all these items that you just believe are very important. If you're on a tight budget, most of us are going to be on a tight budget. There's only really one way I think that's effective to do this is you have to, if you can walk away at least for 24 hours, as I mentioned, delayed gratification, rather than purchasing it now, okay, unless you find something that's just a fantastic deal, okay? But if in most cases, it's sales items, it's items that are marked down, and it's easy for us to look at those items and perceive savings from those items. But we may purchase 2 or 3, 4 items that really are not as significant as what it would have been if we bought something else. So you have to think about that trade-off. That can be very tricky, okay? Because it's hard for us to reason through that process when we see those items. But if you find yourself where you just feel like you want to start buying stuff and you're rushing in for impulsive purchases, leave. You want to walk out if you can and just allow yourself a cool off period, because the goal here is that if you can walk away and cool off for a second and just think through broadly, you might second guess that purchase, okay? So that you're not regretting that you spent an additional $150 on items that really didn't really do a whole lot for the holiday experience. You know, maybe it's not the gifts that folks really wanted, or it's not the stuff that you really originally planned. You're just perceiving some type of savings. Again, if you find some items that are just really fantastic and you think this is it, you've comparison shopped, you've done all the work, you've planned, buy the items. That's probably a good thing that you were lucky to find those things. But in most cases, it doesn't turn out that way. It's usually items that we don't entirely need. We're just kind of assuming we're getting these great deals, but there's always a trade-off. Now I've spent $150 to $200 that I don't have to spend on other items. So now I got to spend another $150 and I'm over budget. Walk away, cool off, and then really think that process through.
Looks like we may just have a couple more questions. This next one is, what are your thoughts on a store credit card to save a percentage?
Yeah, well, you're going to be offered lots of deals this year with retail cards. There will be all sorts of things, and sometimes you'll get the key here is that, we're looking at this 10% off, or it'll be a whole range of things in terms of how much you're able to save. There's a lot of clear research on this. The truth is that those original 10% purchases that you may have saved, what we know through time is that it's retail cards are where we see significant debt. And I certainly see that at Trinity because we deal with credit cards. But retail cards broadly, they're narrow in scope. You can only use those cards at those particular stores. They have limited applicability, so it's only good at that particular store. But financially, what we see is that even if you get that 10% off, and you're excited about that 10% off as you open that card, in most cases, what will happen is as you use that card through time, if you're not paying it off, the 10% up front is really nothing. Because what will happen is through time, there's a tendency for folks to overspend throughout the year as they've opened a new retail card, particularly in clothing or technology. So the 10% off that was originally offered is really null. It doesn't matter. And what happens is that you wind up with retail cards accumulating debt through time, and then you're just overextended at some point. So an alternative to that as well is that if you have a credit card as opposed to the 10%, it already has a decent interest rate, and that you plan to pay off a card, even if you have some debt, you can still pay off this debt within 90 days if it's a larger purchase and you can't get a 0%. I would say use the other credit card and just get the credit. Try to use that other credit card as opposed to opening a new card. Again, the holidays is a time where you're going to see lots of offers in the credit card market because the market is responding, looking for new entrants into this market. They want you to accumulate, use this card through time and potentially accumulate some debt through time so they make some money on the card. It's all going to come down to usage, but in most cases, I would not open new cards. Look for other ways to finance this holiday and avoid becoming another research statistic where you've accumulated additional debt.
All right, and that was actually our last question for today. If anyone has any further questions you'd like to discuss with Todd one-on-one, his contact information is up on the screen. You can feel free to reach out to him directly, or you can always email events@gecreditunion.org, and I'm happy to make that introduction for you. But with that, thank you all for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.